October 14th, 1943, 11:47 a.m., 24,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. First Lieutenant James Jimmy Harlow felt a concussion before he heard it, a deep, bone-shaking thud that traveled through the aluminum skin of his B-24 Liberator like a giant had punched the aircraft's belly. The instrument panel exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. Hydraulic fluid, hot as coffee and smelling like burnt rubber, sprayed across his flight jacket. Through the shattered windscreen, he could see number 3 engine trailing black smoke that bent backward in the slipstream like a funeral shroud. The yoke kicked hard left in his hands, trying to roll the bomber inverted. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Chen, a Stanford engineering student 9 months ago, was screaming something, but the wind howling through the broken nose drowned every word. Behind them in the bomb bay they'd just emptied over the ball-bearing plants below, a fire was spreading along hydraulic lines, eating its way toward the wing fuel tanks. They had maybe 3 minutes before the whole aircraft became a fireball. Outside the shattered plexiglass, Schweinfurt burned beneath them. But Jimmy Harlow wasn't looking at the target. He was looking at the altimeter spinning counterclockwise, the artificial horizon tumbling uselessly, and the airspeed indicator that had frozen at 140 knots, except they were falling much faster than that. In the navigator's compartment, Technical Sergeant Michael Wojcik was already clipping his chest pack to his harness, one hand pressed against a cut on his forehead that painted his oxygen mask red. The intercom was dead. The only sound was the wind, the dying scream of damaged engines, and somewhere in the tail section, someone praying in Polish. Before we go any further, if stories like this one about the impossible moments that define the war speak to you, hit that subscribe button. These aren't Hollywood fairy tales. These are documented cases that still leave historians shaking their heads 78 years later. The 445th Bombardment Group had launched from Tibenham, England at 06:15 that morning with 31 aircraft. The target was Schweinfurt's Kugelfischer ball-bearing plant, the same target that had cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and 600 men 3 months earlier. This time the planners promised would be different. This time they had long-range fighter escort, P-47 Thunderbolts modified with drop tanks that would stay with the bombers deep into Germany. This time the losses would be acceptable. The planners were wrong. They were always wrong when they used words like acceptable in the same sentence as casualty figures. Jimmy Harlow's crew had drawn aircraft 4278231, a factory-fresh Liberator with only 4 missions under her belt. Some crews gave their bombers names, painted nose art of girls or sharks or cartoon characters. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Paul Dvorak, a Cleveland machinist who'd been maintaining aircraft since the B-17s were still experimental, told them not to bother. "She's too new to have a personality yet," he said while signing off the pre-flight inspection. "Fly her gentle, she'll bring you home." The crew was young even by bomber standards. Jimmy Harlow, the aircraft commander, was 23. His co-pilot Chen was 21. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant Thomas Fletcher from Georgia, looked about 17 and probably was. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Ray Kowalski, was the old man at 26, a Chicago mechanical engineer who'd been working on diesel locomotives before the draft notice arrived. The rest, Navigator Wojcik, radio operator Staff Sergeant Daniel Murphy, ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant James Chen, no relation to the co-pilot, waist gunners Sergeant Howard Klein and Sergeant Marcus Washington, and tail gunner Sergeant Timothy O'Brien, ranged between 19 and 24. They had completed 11 missions together, 14 more, and they'd finished their tour, go home, survive the war. The odds against completing 25 missions were approximately 1 in 4. The formation crossed the English Channel at 08:30, climbing to bombing altitude over Belgium. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, exactly the conditions that made German flak batteries devastatingly accurate. The P-47s stayed with them to the German border, then peeled off at the limit of their range, waggling their wings in a gesture that meant good hunting or maybe goodbye. From the German border to Schweinfurt was 200 miles of hostile airspace defended by the most sophisticated air defense network in the world. The Comhuber line, overlapping radar zones, night fighter bases, searchlight batteries, and 40,000 flak guns of various calibers, had been perfected during 3 years of combat against RAF Bomber Command. The Americans were about to receive their education in German precision. The first flak appeared over Frankfurt, black puffs blooming at exactly their altitude, exactly their heading. Someone in the German radar network had calculated their speed, altitude, and course with slide rule accuracy. The bombers flew straight through it because evasive maneuvers at 180 miles per hour in close formation would cause mid-air collisions that killed more crews than the flak. You flew straight, you trusted your armor, and you prayed that statistics were on your side. Usually they weren't. Aircraft 4278231 took her first hit at 11:15, 32 miles from the target. An 88mm shell, the same weapon that destroyed Allied tanks in North Africa, detonated 50 feet below the tail section. Shrapnel punched through the aluminum skin in 200 places, each hole the size of a quarter. Tail gunner O'Brien reported a fire in the tail wheel well, but his extinguisher bottle knocked it down. First blood, not fatal. They kept flying. The second hit came at 11:34 over the initial point, the spot where bombers straightened out for their attack run. A 105mm shell designed to bring down heavy bombers exploded directly beneath the bomb bay. The aircraft jumped upward like it had been kicked, then shuddered as fragments tore through the aluminum structure. Number 4 engine lost oil pressure and had to be feathered. The bomb bay doors, already partially open for the attack run, jammed fully open, creating massive drag. Airspeed dropped to 150 knots. They were losing the formation, falling behind into the kill zone where German fighters waited for stragglers. Jimmy Harlow pushed the remaining 3 engines to maximum continuous power, settings that would destroy them in 30 minutes, and somehow kept position. They released their bombs at 11:43, 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs that fell away into the smoke and fire below. The bombardier Fletcher reported good hits on the target, but nobody cared about the target anymore. They cared about surviving the next 3 minutes of flak, the deadliest 3 minutes in aviation, when the bombers had to hold course and altitude for the bomb run, while German gunners knew exactly where they'd be. That's when the shell that changed everything detonated. Time 11:47. An 88mm proximity fused shell exploded 15 feet below the cockpit, precisely between the nose wheel well and number 2 engine. Shrapnel shredded hydraulic lines, electrical cables, oxygen systems, and control runs. The concussion shattered every instrument in the cockpit. Number 3 engine caught fire immediately, the cowling peeling back as flames licked along the wing toward the fuel tanks. Worse, far worse, the explosion severed most of the control cables running from the cockpit through the bomb bay to the tail surfaces. When Jimmy Harlow pulled back on the yoke to arrest their sudden dive, nothing happened. The elevators didn't respond. The rudder pedals went slack. Aileron control was marginal at best. They had become a 32-ton glider with 3 engines and a fire, falling through 24,000 feet with approximately 90 seconds until the wing fuel tanks exploded. In the navigator's compartment, Michael Wojcik was trying to compute their position while blood ran into his eyes from the forehead cut. His instruments were destroyed, his maps shredded by shrapnel, and the aircraft was shaking so violently that he couldn't read his watch. But he was a navigator, trained at Mather Field to a dead-reckoned position using nothing but time, airspeed, and heading. He knew they were approximately 75 miles inside Germany, heading west at reduced speed with an 8,000-foot altitude loss in the last minute. If they bailed out here, they'd be captured before they hit the ground. If they stayed with the aircraft, they'd die when the fuel tanks exploded. He felt the airframe shudder again, a deep, wrong vibration that meant structural failure somewhere, and reached for his chest-pack parachute. The decision had been made. Jimmy Harlow's voice crackled over the dying intercom, barely audible through the static and wind noise. "Bail out! Bail out! This is not a drill." He repeated it 3 times, the trained response drilled into every aircraft commander. Then the intercom died completely, the electrical system finally giving up. But the crew had heard enough. In the nose section, Bombardier Fletcher was already pulling the emergency escape hatch release. In the waist section, gunners Klein and Washington were helping each other clip on chest packs, their hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. Ball turret gunner James Chen rotated his turret to exit position, squeezed out of the cramped sphere, and grabbed his chute from its rack. Radio operator Murphy sent one final transmission. Forward 45th aircraft bailing out grid reference Papa Zulu 47, before pulling his headset off and moving toward the waste exit. Flight engineer Kowalski made one last check of the fire in number 3 engine, saw flames reaching the wing root, and knew they had maybe 60 seconds before catastrophic failure. He turned toward the bomb bay, where the forward crew would exit, but stopped when he saw co-pilot Chen still in his seat, hands on the controls, trying to help Jimmy Harlow maintain some semblance of level flight while the crew escaped. The bailout sequence happened in stages, each man going through a mental checklist even as panic screamed at them to jump immediately. Fletcher went first, pulling the emergency hatch handle and feeling the sudden hurricane of wind as the nose hatch blew away. He rolled through the opening, tucking into a ball, and fell away into the slipstream at 180 miles per hour. Navigator Wojcik followed 3 seconds later, his chute pack catching momentarily on the hatch frame before tearing free. He fell past the number 1 engine, its propeller still spinning, close enough to feel the prop wash before gravity took him. In the waist section, Klein and Washington jumped together through the side door, exactly as they'd practiced in training, exactly as they'd hoped they'd never have to do in combat. The tail gunner O'Brien had the worst exit. He had to crawl forward through the destroyed tail section, past jagged metal and severed cables to reach the waist door. He could feel the tail starting to break away, could hear the groaning of stressed metal. He pulled himself through the debris, grabbed the door frame, and jumped into nothing. Ball turret gunner James Chen and radio operator Murphy went together, counting to 3 in unison before stepping into the 21,000-foot void. In the cockpit, flight engineer Kowalski physically pulled co-pilot Chen from his seat. "We're done here," he screamed over the wind. "Jimmy's got it. Go! Go!" Chen hesitated. "You don't abandon your aircraft, Commander." It violated every protocol. But Kowalski was already pushing him toward the bomb bay. Chen went, half falling through the bomb bay opening, his chute harness catching on something before jerking free. He fell away, watching the bomber's shadow pass over him as he dropped. Kowalski turned back to the cockpit, where Jimmy Harlow was still in the pilot's seat, both hands on the yoke, trying to control an aircraft that wouldn't respond to inputs. "Jimmy," Kowalski grabbed his shoulder. "She's gone. We gotta go." Jimmy Harlow turned, and Kowalski saw something in his eyes that he'd remember for the rest of his life. Not panic, not acceptance, but a kind of furious determination that made no rational sense. The aircraft was dying. The wing was on fire. The controls were gone. There was nothing left to save. But Jimmy Harlow wasn't ready to let her go. "Get out, Ray," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind and dying engines. "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. But Kowalski was out of time. He grabbed his chest pack, clipped it on, and dropped through the bomb bay opening into the howling void. The last thing he saw was Jimmy Harlow, lone in the cockpit of a dying bomber, still fighting the controls as if willpower alone could keep 32 tons of aluminum in the sky. The entire bailout sequence took 97 seconds from Jimmy Harlow's order to Ray Kowalski's exit. 9 men descended under white silk canopies toward German territory, toward capture in prisoner of war camps and survival. They watched their bomber, their aircraft, their responsibility, the machine they'd flown through 11 missions, begin its death spiral. Except it didn't. At approximately 19,000 feet, aircraft 4278231 did something impossible. The nose, which had been dropping steadily toward vertical, slowly came up. The wings, which had been rolling toward inverted, leveled. The fire in number 3 engine didn't go out, but it stopped spreading as if someone had reduced the throttle to cut off fuel flow. The bomber, which should have been a tumbling wreck by now, steadied into a shallow descent, heading west, still flying. The 9 descending crewmen stared in disbelief. Several would later report thinking they'd suffered head injuries during bailout, that they were hallucinating. But they all saw the same impossible thing. Their abandoned bomber was flying itself. Technical Sergeant Michael Wojcik, still descending through 15,000 feet with a parachute that oscillated wildly in the turbulent air, had a navigator's eye for detail. He noticed the bomber wasn't just flying, it was flying a course. West-northwest, approximately 285 degrees magnetic, the heading back toward England. The engines he could still see, numbers 1 and 2 on the left wing, were running at what looked like cruise power, not the emergency settings Jimmy had been using. As he watched, unable to look away despite needing to prepare for landing, the bomber descended through a cloud layer and disappeared. He realized in that moment that he was watching something that couldn't be explained by aerodynamics or mechanical failure or any training he'd received. Aircraft don't fly themselves. They especially don't fly themselves after catastrophic battle damage has severed their control systems. Yet he'd seen it with his own eyes, and 8 other men had seen it too. The German reception for the 9 American airmen was swift and efficient. Wehrmacht infantry units had been tracking the bomber formation's progress across their sector and were already moving toward the approximate bailout location when the parachutes appeared. All 9 crew members were on the ground and surrounded within 20 minutes of landing. The process was almost courteous. German soldiers in field gray, some of them older men from reserve units, collected parachutes, confiscated sidearms, checked for injuries, and provided water. Nobody was beaten or mistreated, though Sergeant Washington, the waist gunner from Alabama, received some curious stares from German soldiers who'd never seen an African American before. The prevailing emotion among the captors was something approaching sympathy. They were soldiers too. They understood what it meant to watch your aircraft, your ship, your vehicle die. The fact that all 9 men had survived was remarkable enough to generate quiet respect. The interrogations began that evening at a Luftwaffe intelligence facility near Würzburg. The 9 crew members were separated, each placed in solitary cells, and questioned by surprisingly courteous intelligence officers who spoke perfect English and knew disturbing amounts of information about American bomber operations. The questions followed standard patterns: unit identification, aircraft performance, target information, formation tactics, questions the Americans were trained to deflect with name, rank, and serial number. But then the German interrogator interviewing Flight Engineer Kowalski asked something unexpected. "Where is your pilot? We recovered 9 parachutes. Your aircraft normally carries 10 crew." Kowalski felt his stomach drop. In the chaos of bailout and capture, he hadn't thought about Jimmy Harlow. They'd all assumed, that Jimmy had followed them out, that he'd been captured separately. The German officer saw the recognition in Kowalski's face. "Your aircraft commander did not bail out?" "He was right behind me," Kowalski said automatically, but the lie sounded hollow even to him. The German officer made a note, then asked another question that made no sense. "Did your aircraft have any experimental control systems? Any automatic flight equipment beyond standard autopilot?" Kowalski stared at him. It was a factory standard B-24J, nothing experimental. "Why?" The German officer didn't answer, just made another note and ended the interview. Kowalski was returned to his cell with a gnawing fear growing in his chest. If Jimmy Harlow hadn't bailed out, he'd gone in with the aircraft. But where had the aircraft gone in? And why were the Germans asking about automatic flight systems? The answer was already spreading through Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe intelligence channels, like a technical ghost story that nobody wanted to admit they believed. At 12:53 p.m., approximately 1 hour and 6 minutes after the crew bail out, a Luftwaffe observation post near Kleve, Germany, just across the Dutch border, reported a B-24 Liberator approaching from the east at approximately 5,000 feet, flying straight and level, visibly damaged but under apparent control. The aircraft flew directly over the observation post, low enough that observers could see the open bomb bay doors, the fire-scorched No. 3 engine cowling, and hundreds of shrapnel holes across the fuselage. What they couldn't see was any crew. The cockpit appeared empty. The aircraft continued west, crossing into occupied Netherlands at 1:04 p.m. and began a gentle descent. Multiple Dutch civilians, German security personnel, and Wehrmacht units reported the bomber's passage. Every report contained the same impossible detail. The aircraft was flying perfectly, as if an experienced pilot were at the controls, but the cockpit was visibly empty. At 1:14 p.m., the bomber approached a flat agricultural area near the village of Zundert, Netherlands, approximately 3 miles from the Belgian border. What happened next was witnessed by 47 people: Dutch farmers, German soldiers manning a checkpoint, children who'd been watching the aircraft with a mixture of fear and fascination. The bomber's landing gear extended. This alone was impossible. Landing gear on a B-24 required hydraulic pressure or emergency mechanical extension, both requiring pilot action. The gear locked down with all three wheels in position: nose, left main, right main. The aircraft continued its descent. The approach angle shallow and controlled, the wings level. At approximately 200 feet, the bomber's nose came up slightly, reducing descent rate in a perfect landing flare. At 50 feet, the engines throttled back, airspeed decreasing to landing speed. Then, with the precision of a training exercise, the aircraft settled onto the field, touched down on all three wheels, and rolled approximately 400 yards before coming to rest in a drainage ditch at the field's edge. The impact with the ditch collapsed the nose gear and bent the propellers, but the fuselage remained intact. There was no explosion. The fire in number 3 engine had gone out at some point during the flight. The aircraft had just completed a perfect dead-stick landing without a pilot. The first German soldiers to reach the aircraft approached carefully, weapons ready, expecting either an elaborate trap or some new American technical trick they hadn't been briefed on. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, a Wehrmacht military policeman from Stuttgart, whose peacetime job had been investigating industrial accidents, was part of the first response team. His report, recovered from Wehrmacht archives in 1982, provides the most detailed contemporary account of what they found. We approached from the rear, covering all exits. The tail section showed extensive damage: bullet holes, shrapnel tears, structural deformation. The fire in the left wing engine had consumed the cowling, but the wing structure remained intact. We called for the crew to exit. No response. Feldwebel Mann climbed the waist door and entered. After approximately 2 minutes, he emerged and stated the aircraft was empty. Completely empty. No crew, living or dead. The interior inspection revealed something that made no mechanical sense. The cockpit controls were in neutral positions: throttles at idle, mixture controls at auto lean, propeller controls at automatic. The control yoke was centered. The rudder pedals were neutral. But the trim tabs, the small control surfaces that pilots use to maintain attitude without constant control input, were set to maintain a slight nose-up attitude and gentle left bank, exactly the configuration needed to compensate for the dead number 4 engine and maintain level flight. More disturbing, the autopilot was disengaged. The Honeywell C1 autopilot, standard equipment on B-24s, was in the off position. Someone or something had flown this aircraft manually for 81 miles and executed a perfect landing without using the automated systems that might have explained the impossible. Technical investigations began immediately. The Luftwaffe, desperate for intelligence on American technology, sent their best aircraft engineers to examine the wreck. Oberst Lieutenant Friedrich Halder, a Junkers aeronautical engineer before the war, who now analyzed captured Allied aircraft, spent 3 days examining every system on 42 to 78231. His classified report, discovered in Soviet archives in 1991, is a masterpiece of frustrated scientific inquiry. The aircraft shows catastrophic damage to primary control systems. Control cables to elevator and rudder surfaces are severed in multiple locations. Hydraulic systems are without pressure due to combat damage. The probability of achieving controlled flight with this damage is effectively zero. The probability of achieving a controlled landing approaches infinity. Yet the physical evidence, landing gear extension, engine power management, landing flare execution, indicates controlled flight occurred. We have found no experimental control systems, no automatic landing equipment, nothing beyond standard B-24 specifications. The only logical conclusion is that a crew member remained with the aircraft. Physical evidence contradicts this conclusion. There is no crew, no bodies, no parachutes, no indication anyone was aboard during the landing phase. This investigator cannot explain the observed facts. But there was one piece of evidence that Halder either missed or deliberately omitted from his report. Staff Sergeant Heinrich Muller, a Luftwaffe mechanic assisting with the investigation, noticed something odd in the cockpit. The pilot's seat, which should have been empty, had a depression in the cushion. Not the gradual compression of an empty seat settling over time, but the distinct impression of someone having sat there recently. The seat was cold, but the impression was fresh. Mueller mentioned this to Halder, who allegedly told him to forget it and never include it in his report. Mueller, interviewed in 1907 before his death, insisted the impression was real, that something or someone had occupied that seat during the flight. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said, "but I believe what I saw. Someone sat there. The aircraft didn't fly itself. Something flew it." The mystery deepened when German intelligence finally connected the abandoned bomber to the captured crew. On October 18th, 4 days after the bailout, Hauptmann Werner Schultz, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer, interviewed the crew members again, this time with specific questions about their aircraft commander. Where had Lieutenant Harlow bailed out? Had anyone seen his parachute deploy? Had he been injured during the combat damage? The answers created a puzzle that Schultz couldn't solve. Flight engineer Kowalski insisted that Jimmy Harlow had been in the cockpit when Kowalski bailed out. Co-pilot Chen confirmed this. Harlow had been at the controls when Chen exited, but no one had actually seen Harlow bail out. No one had seen his parachute. The last man to exit, Kowalski, had left Harlow in a dying aircraft that should have crashed within seconds. Yet the aircraft had flown for over 80 miles and landed itself perfectly. The logical conclusion was that Harlow had remained with the bomber, somehow maintained control despite severed cables, somehow executed a perfect landing despite impossible conditions. But if Harlow had landed the aircraft, where was he? A Wehrmacht search team swept the area around the landing site, looking for any sign of the missing pilot. They found nothing, no parachute, no body, no equipment, no footprints in the soft Dutch soil around the aircraft. The local Dutch population, quietly interviewed by German security personnel, reported seeing and hearing nothing unusual except the bomber's landing. No one had seen an American pilot exit the aircraft. No one had heard gunfire that might indicate he'd been shot while evading. He had simply vanished, as if he'd never existed at all. The German conclusion, reluctantly accepted because no alternative explanation fit the facts, was that Lieutenant Harlow had somehow bailed out during the flight at an unknown location, and the aircraft had continued on its own through some combination of aerodynamic stability and blind luck. The landing was dismissed as coincidence. The aircraft happened to descend in a shallow glide that happened to result in the gear extending through gravity and wind pressure, and happened to touch down at a survivable speed. It was astronomically unlikely, but less impossible than the alternative, that a ghost had flown the aircraft home. The crew spent the remainder of the war in various prisoner camps, Stalag Luft 3 for the officers, Stalag Sek 7B for the enlisted men. They maintained silence about the circumstances of their bailout and their aircraft commander's fate. The Geneva Convention forbade interrogators from pressing too hard, and the German intelligence officers eventually moved on to more pressing matters, like the fact that American bombers were coming over Germany in 1,000-plane raids and destroying everything. The mystery of aircraft 4278231 was filed away, classified, and largely forgotten, except by the 9 men who'd bailed out over Germany and watched their bomber fly away without them. Liberation came in 1945. The crew members returned to the United States between April and June, separately, through different repatriation routes. They were debriefed at Fort Dix, New Jersey, by Army Air Force intelligence officers who listened to their story with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disbelief. The official conclusion, stamped on their debriefing reports: aircraft 4278231 was lost due to combat damage over Germany, October 14, 1943. Crew successfully bailed out. Pilot Second Lieutenant James M. Harlow remains missing in action, presumed killed in action. Aircraft fate unknown. The perfectly landed bomber. The impossible 80-mile flight. The landing gear that shouldn't have worked. All of it was classified as unexplained, but not requiring further investigation. The Army Air Force had a war to win. They didn't have time for ghost stories. The crew held an informal reunion in Chicago in September 1945 at Ray Kowalski's family home, a working-class brick house that smelled like pirogas and polished sausage. All 9 surviving members attended. They spent the first hour drinking, the second hour avoiding the subject they'd all come to discuss, and the third hour finally confronting the truth. None of them knew what had happened to Jimmy Harlow or how their bomber had flown itself home. They compared stories, looking for inconsistencies, looking for some rational explanation they'd all missed. The stories matched perfectly. Every man remembered the same sequence of events, the same impossible sight of a crewless bomber flying itself west. Michael Wojcik, who'd kept his navigator's log hidden from German interrogators and brought it home, had written a note on October 14, 1943, bailed out at 11:47 hours, aircraft continued west under control. No explanation possible. The entry had been written in faded pencil while Wojcik was in German captivity before he could have known what the Wehrmacht investigation would find. He'd written what he saw, knowing it would sound insane. Maybe Jimmy did stay with it, co-pilot Robert Chen suggested, already half drunk on Kowalski's home-brewed beer. Maybe he landed it, got out before the Germans arrived, evaded capture. For 80 miles with no controls? Kowalski shook his head. I watched the cable snap. I saw it with my own eyes. The elevators weren't responding. You can't fly a B-24 without elevator control. Then what's your explanation, Ray? Chen's voice had an edge now. Because the only alternatives are that Jimmy pulled off a miracle or that something else flew that bomber. Silence filled the room. Nobody wanted to say the word that they were all thinking. Ghost, spirit, something beyond mechanical explanation or aerodynamic possibility. They were engineers, navigators, mechanics, men who understood physics and systems and logical cause and effect. But they'd all seen the same impossible thing, and 30 years of education and training couldn't explain it away. The mystery might have died there, another war story told quietly among veterans and dismissed by historians as exaggeration or misremembering, except for a letter that arrived at Ray Kowalski's house in December 1945. The envelope was postmarked from Netherlands, sent through military channels, forwarded by the War Department with a note. Delivered as received, contents not verified. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful English, dated November 12, 1945. Dear American Airmen, I am writing to you regarding the aircraft that landed in our fields, October 14, 1943. My name is Hendrik Vanderberg. I am a farmer near Zundert. I saw your bomber land. I was in my field, very close, when it came down. The German soldiers arrived quickly and took the aircraft. But before they came, I went to the bomber. I looked inside. I found something the Germans did not find, or perhaps they found it and did not report it. Inside the cockpit, on the floor near the pilot's seat, I found an American flight jacket. It had the name Harlow stenciled inside the collar. The jacket was warm, as if someone had just removed it, but there was no one in the aircraft. I hid the jacket before the soldiers came. I still have it. If you want it returned, please write to me. I thought you should know that someone was in that cockpit when it landed. I do not know where they went, but they left their jacket behind. The crew verified the letter's authenticity through Red Cross channels and military liaison offices. Hendrik Vanderberg was real. His farm was in the exact location where the bomber had landed, and he had indeed found a flight jacket with James Harlow's name inside. Ray Kowalski offered to pay any price for the jacket's return. Vanderberg refused payment but sent the jacket through diplomatic pouch in February 1946. It arrived in a carefully wrapped package, still smelling faintly of smoke and hydraulic fluid and something else. Something that Kowalski, holding the jacket with shaking hands, identified as Jimmy Harlow's aftershave, the cheap drugstore brand he'd worn every day, the smell that had filled the cockpit during 11 missions. The jacket showed no blood, no tears, no indication of violent removal. It had simply been taken off and left behind, as if Jimmy Harlow had shrugged out of it after completing a routine training flight, expecting to pick it up later. Except he'd never picked it up, and no one had ever found him. The War Department, presented with this new evidence, reopened the case briefly in 1946, then closed it again with the same conclusion. Missing in action, presumed dead. The jacket was returned to Harlow's mother in Wisconsin. She kept it until her death in 1959, at which point it was donated to the 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia, where it remains today, displayed with a small placard. Flight jacket belonging to 2nd Lieutenant James M. Harlow, pilot of B-24 78231, lost over Germany, October 14, 1943. Circumstances of loss unexplained. German records, examined exhaustively after the war during the massive Allied intelligence effort to document every aspect of Nazi military operations, provided no additional clarity. The classified Luftwaffe reports on aircraft 78231 were captured by British intelligence in 1945 and eventually shared with American researchers. The technical analysis confirmed everything the crew had reported: catastrophic control system damage, impossible flight characteristics, no explanation for the observed behavior. But there was one additional detail buried in an appendix, a note from Oberst Leutnant Halder that had been stamped not for distribution. During examination of cockpit controls, this investigator observed compass deviation consistent with recent heading changes. Aircraft compass showed heading of 287 degrees magnetic, which corresponds to course from bailout location to landing site. Trim tab settings indicate deliberate compensation for asymmetric engine failure. These observations suggest active pilot control during final flight phase. As no pilot was present, these observations remain unexplained. The most detailed analysis came from an unexpected source: the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, a comprehensive post-war study of Allied bombing effectiveness. A subsection on bomber losses included a technical appendix examining unusual loss circumstances. Aircraft 78231 rated an entire chapter, written by an Army Air Force aeronautical engineer named Captain David Morrison, who'd investigated the wreck in 1945 during the occupation. Morrison's conclusion was brutally honest. This investigator has examined every system on subject aircraft. The combat damage was sufficient to render controlled flight impossible using standard control inputs. The subsequent flight of 81 miles and controlled landing cannot be explained using known aeronautical principles. Theories proposed include: 1. Pilot remained with aircraft and used emergency control methods, contradicted by lack of pilot and physical impossibility of controlling aircraft with severed cables. 2. Aerodynamic stability resulted in extended glide, contradicted by power settings indicating engine operation and trim settings indicating active control. 3. Unknown automatic flight systems, contradicted by complete examination finding only standard equipment. This investigator's conclusion: the observed events cannot be explained with current understanding of aircraft systems and human capabilities. Further investigation recommended. There was never further investigation. The crew members went on with their lives, as veterans do, carrying memories that didn't fit into civilian existence. Ray Kowalski returned to his Chicago engineering firm, married, raised 3 children, and never mentioned the war unless asked directly. Robert Chen finished his Stanford engineering degree on the GI Bill, joined Boeing, and spent 30 years designing commercial aircraft that incorporated safety systems, inspired by watching his bomber fly itself home. Michael Wojcik became a mathematics professor, teaching navigation and celestial mechanics to students who couldn't understand why he sometimes stopped mid-lecture, staring into space as if calculating an impossible position. The others scattered across America: Marcus Washington to Alabama, where he became a minister; Timothy O'Brien to Boston, where he ran a bar frequented by veterans who told stories that nobody else believed; Howard Klein to Los Angeles, where he worked in aerospace manufacturing, building parts for aircraft that would eventually go to the moon. They maintained contact through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, the loose network of men who'd shared something they couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Once every 5 years, they held a reunion, usually in Chicago, where they'd gather in Ray Kowalski's basement, drink beer, and eventually return to the same conversation. What happened to Jimmy Harlow, and who, or what, flew their bomber home? The theories multiplied over the years, each one more elaborate than the last. Maybe Jimmy had bailed out over the Netherlands, landed safely, evaded capture, and somehow made it back to the aircraft before the Germans arrived, flying it those final miles before escaping again. Except the timeline didn't work. The aircraft landed at 1:14 p.m., less than 90 minutes after the crew bailout over Germany. Not enough time for a parachute descent, evasion, and return. Maybe he'd been thrown from the aircraft during the explosion, knocked unconscious, and regained awareness mid-fall only to find himself already too low to survive. But then who flew the bomber? The most unsettling theory came from Bombardier Thomas Fletcher during the 1965 reunion. He'd been drinking steadily for 3 hours when he finally said what they had all been thinking. What if Jimmy never left? What if he died in that cockpit when we bailed out, and something else, something we don't have words for, kept him there long enough to bring us home? The room went silent. That bomber was alive, Fletcher continued, his Georgia drawl slurred but his eyes clear. 11 missions, she kept us safe. We gave her everything, trusted her with our lives. Maybe she gave something back. Maybe she knew Jimmy wouldn't leave her, so she didn't leave him. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued. They'd all felt it on some level, the sense that their aircraft had been more than aluminum and rivets, that the hundreds of hours they'd spent entwined her had created something beyond mechanical function. Ray Kowalski died in 1992, taking with him the last clear memory of seeing Jimmy Harlow in that cockpit, hands on the controls, fighting to save a bomber that couldn't be saved. The last surviving crew member, Robert Chen, passed away in 2009 at age 97. Before his death, he gave one final interview to an aviation historian. "We were supposed to die that day, all of us, but something wouldn't let us. Call it luck, call it physics we don't understand, call it whatever helps you sleep. I know what I saw. I saw our bomber fly home without us. And I think Jimmy Harlow flew it there, even though he couldn't have, even though it was impossible. He promised he'd bring us home. He kept his promise." Aircraft 42-78231's wreckage was scrapped by Dutch salvage crews in 1947. The flight jacket remains in Georgia. James Harlow's name is carved on the tablets of the missing at Netherlands American Cemetery, one of 1,722 airmen who have no known grave. And sometimes on October